Welcome back to Lotus Story Vault. The first thing you should know about old money is that it has a very specific smell. It doesn't smell like fresh dollar bills or expensive cologne. It smells like lemon oil, ancient dust, and unearned arrogance. Right now, that smell was suffocating me. I sat in the corner of Harrison Vance's downtown Chicago corner office, my scuffed steel-toed Timberlands sinking into a Persian rug that probably cost more than my college tuition. I was 28 years old, a restoration architect who spent her days inhaling plaster dust and arguing with general contractors. I didn't belong in a room paneled in imported mahogany, and I certainly didn't belong with the people sitting across from me. Sloane Gallagher, my oldest half-brother, was rhythmically tapping a solid gold Mont Blanc pen against the edge of the glass conference table. Tap, tap, tap. Every strike was a testament to his impatience. At 35, Declan was a venture capitalist who looked exactly like the kind of guy who would foreclose on an orphanage if the margins were right. His custom-tailored Tom Ford suit stretched across his shoulders, his jaw clenched tight. Next to him sat Maeve, my half-sister. At 32, she was the CEO of a lifestyle brand that sold overpriced linen napkins and curated wellness crystals to bored housewives. She was currently staring at her phone, her perfectly manicured thumbs flying across the screen. She hadn't looked at me once since I walked in. To Maeve, I wasn't a person. I was a smudge on the pristine glass of the Gallagher family legacy. "Can we wrap this up, Vance?" Declan finally snapped, tossing the pen onto the table. It clattered loudly. "I have a board meeting at 1 o'clock. Some of us actually work for a living." He shot a venomous glare in my direction. I just smiled, leaning back in my leather chair. "Funny," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the intimidation he was so desperately trying to provoke. I was just thinking the same thing. My crew is waiting for me to approve a load-bearing beam on a 19th century brownstone. Unlike moving invisible numbers around on a screen, if I screw up, the roof literally falls in. Malve scoffed, finally looking up from her phone. Her icy blue eyes, the exact same shade as our late father's, narrowed. "Oh, please, Sloane. Don't act like your little blue-collar hobby makes you morally superior. We all know why you're here. You're waiting for a handout." "I'm here because the court mandated it, Maeve," I said, picking at a fleck of dried primer on my thumbnail. "I'm fully expecting a check for $5,000 and a polite request to never use the Gallagher name in public again. Just print the waiver, Vance. I'll sign it right now." That was the truth. Arthur Gallagher, Chicago's most ruthless commercial real estate tycoon, was technically my biological father, but he was never my dad. I was the illegitimate child, the result of an affair that had been swept under the rug 2 decades ago. Arthur had paid for my mother's hospital bills and my cheap state college tuition, always through an anonymous proxy, never directly. I had spoken to the man exactly 4 times in my entire life. His recent death from a sudden heart attack hadn't brought me grief. It had just brought me a subpoena. Before the bickering could escalate, the heavy oak doors opened. Cecelia Gallagher drifted into the room. If Maeve was ice and Declan was fire, Cecelia was a gentle, calming breeze. At 55, my father's second wife and widow was the picture of understated elegance. A former art curator turned high society philanthropist, she wore a simple but impossibly chic charcoal cashmere dress. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned back elegantly. "Declan, Maeve, please," Cecelia murmured, her voice soft, musical, and utterly soothing. She placed a gentle hand on Declan's shoulder before taking the seat at the head of the table. She looked over at me, her eyes brimming with a warmth that I fundamentally did not understand. "Sloane, thank you so much for coming. I know this is uncomfortable for you." I offered a tight, non-committal nod. Cecelia had always been the anomaly. Whenever Arthur's legal team had tried to legally erase me, Cecelia was supposedly the one who intervened. She was the one who sent me polite, handwritten birthday cards every year. I never replied. I didn't trust her kindness. In a family of sharks, a dolphin is usually just a shark in a very good disguise. Behind Cecelia, Harrison Vance walked in. The family lawyer was a tall, skeletal man in his late 40s, with a face devoid of any human emotion. He carried a thick leather folder. "Thank you all for your patience," Vance said, his voice a dry monotone. He didn't offer condolences. Lawyers like Vance didn't deal in feelings, they dealt in assets. He took his seat, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and opened the folder. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Thomas Gallagher." Declan leaned forward, practically vibrating with greed. Maeve locked her phone and slipped it into her designer purse, suddenly giving Vance her undivided attention. "I will skip the standard legal preamble and proceed directly to the distribution of the primary estate," Vance said, his eyes scanning the document. "To my wife, Cecelia Gallagher, I leave the sum of $20 million in liquid assets, as previously stipulated in our prenuptial agreement, along with the summer property in Aspen." Cecelia nodded graciously, her expression serene. She didn't flinch at the number. 20 million was a drop in the bucket of Arthur's empire, but it was exactly what she had signed up for. "To my son, Declan Arthur Gallagher, and my daughter, Maeve Catherine Gallagher." Vance paused. Declan smirked at me. It was a fleeting, predatory thing. He was already spending the money in his head. "I leave the sum of $5 million each, placed into a locked, irrevocable trust." Vance continued, his tone unchanging. "These funds are to be managed by a third-party executor and distributed in monthly stipends. They are not to be touched in their entirety." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic weather event. "Excuse me?" Declan's voice was barely a whisper. A stipend? Like an allowance?" "That is correct," Vance said, not looking up. "There must be a mistake," Maeve said, her voice trembling, the perfect icy facade cracking instantly. "My father would never. He knows I need capital for my brand expansion. What about the company? What about the North Shore estate?" Vance turned a page. The paper sounded loud in the deadly quiet room. "To my youngest daughter, Sloane Elena Harding," Vance read. My breath hitched. He had used my mother's last name. He had never done that legally before. Vance cleared his throat. "I hereby leave my 73% controlling interest in Gallagher Enterprises, along with the primary residence located in the North Shore, and all remaining unallocated capital and assets. Sloane is to assume the role of majority shareholder and chair of the board, effective immediately, provided she resides in the North Shore estate for a consecutive period of 30 days to ensure a seamless transition of power." I stopped breathing. The room started to spin. The mahogany walls felt like they were closing in. 73%. Controlling interest. The North Shore estate. We weren't talking about $5,000. We were talking about billions. Billions of dollars. Skyscrapers. Commercial developments. A legacy built on ruthless acquisitions and cutthroat deals. "You're out of your mind," Declan whispered. Then, he stood up so fast, his heavy chair crashed backward onto the floor. "You're absolutely out of your crazy mind. That is a forgery. My father would never leave the company to her. She's a nobody, a mistake." "Mr. Gallagher, I assure you," Vance began, completely unbothered by the outburst. "Shut up, Vance," Declan roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You did this. I don't know how, but you got to him. You manipulated a dying man." "Declan, stop it," Cecelia pleaded, standing up, her hands raised in a calming gesture. Maeve was on her feet now too, her face pale. "She's a gold digger, Cecelia. Look at her. She looks like she just crawled out of a dumpster. And now she's supposed to run a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire? I will contest this. I will drag this through the courts until you are utterly bankrupt, Sloane. Do you hear me?" My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want this. I didn't want the company. I didn't want the money. And I definitely didn't want the target that was just painted on my back. I wanted to build things. I wanted to restore, beautiful, broken things. But as I looked at Declan's sneering face and Maeve's look of utter disgust, something else flared to life inside me. Pride. Survival instinct. For 28 years, I had been the family's dirty little secret. I had watched my mother, a brilliant violinist, spiral into debt and despair because of a media scandal that had magically appeared the moment Arthur decided he didn't want her anymore. I had scraped and fought for every single thing I had. They thought I was weak because my boots had dirt on them. They were about to learn that dirt is exactly what you need to build a foundation. I slowly stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "Contest it, Maeve," I said, my voice cold, cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. "Call your lawyers. Drag it through the courts. But understand this. I didn't ask for this. I walked in here expecting a bus ticket home. But if this document is legal, then as of right now, I am the majority shareholder of the company that pays your little stipend." Declan lunged forward, but Vance smoothly stepped between us, finally showing a spark of life. "Any physical intimidation in this room will be documented and used against you in probate court, Mr. Gallagher. I strongly advise you to step back." Declan stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost glowing. "You are not a Gallagher," he spat at me. "You will never be one of us." "Good," I shot back, "because looking at the two of you, being a Gallagher seems like a genetic defect." "Enough!" The voice wasn't a shout, but the sheer authority in it silenced the room instantly. We all turned. Cecelia was standing tall, her gentle demeanor momentarily replaced by a spine of pure steel. She looked between Declan and Maeve, her expression filled with profound disappointment. "Your father made his decision," Cecelia said firmly. "Arthur was many things, but he was not a fool, and he was not easily manipulated. He spent his life building this empire, and he chose who he believed could sustain it." She turned to look at me, her eyes softening again, that unreadable warmth returning. "Sloane is your sister. She is family. And under my roof, you will treat her with the respect she deserves." "She is not my sister," Maeve hissed, grabbing her purse. "And she will never step foot in that house. Come on, Declan, we're leaving." Maeve spun on her heel and stormed out of the office, the heavy oak doors slamming behind her. Declan lingered for a second, glaring at me as if trying to memorize my face for a dartboard. "Enjoy the throne while you can, Sloane," he said quietly. "It's a very high place to fall from." He turned and followed his sister, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. I slowly sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold pit of dread in my stomach. Vance began organizing his papers. "Business as usual. I will have my assistant email you the transition documents, Ms. Harding, or do you prefer Ms. Gallagher now?" "Harding is fine," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "Sloane." I looked up. Cecelia had walked over to my side of the table. Up close, I could smell her perfume, something expensive, floral, and subtle. She reached out and gently placed a hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her touch maternal. "I know this is a shock," Cecelia said softly, her eyes full of sympathy. "Arthur was a complicated man. But in his final months, he expressed a lot of regret regarding you and your mother. He wanted to make things right. I know my stepchildren can be difficult, but I promise you, you won't face this alone. I am here for you." I stared into Cecilia's perfectly manicured face. I looked for a crack in the armor, a hint of deceit, a flicker of an ulterior motive. But there was nothing, just genuine heartbreaking kindness. "I am here for you." It was the exact phrase I had wanted to hear from an adult my entire childhood. "Thank you, Cecelia," I said quietly, carefully withdrawing my hand from under hers. I need to process this." "Of course," she smiled, stepping back. "Take your time, but remember the stipulation. Your 30 days at the North Shore estate begin this Friday. I'll have the guest wing prepared for you. I think we have a lot of lost time to make up for." She gave me one last, comforting nod before turning and exiting the room. I sat alone with the lawyer, the smell of mahogany, and the weight of $1 billion empire pressing down on my shoulders. I was an architect. I knew how to look at a structure and see its flaws. I knew how to spot a rotting foundation beneath a fresh coat of paint. Arthur's will made no sense. Declan and Maeve's rage made perfect sense. But Cecelia? Cecelia's kindness was the most structurally unsound thing I had ever seen. People at the top of the food chain didn't just hand over power without a fight. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. And I was going to have to move into that gothic, freezing North Shore mansion to figure out exactly what it was. I looked down at my work boots, taking a deep breath. My restoration project was going to have to wait. I had a family empire to dismantle first. The iron gates of the North Shore estate didn't just close behind me. They locked with a heavy metallic thud that sounded entirely too much like a prison cell. 30 days. I just had to survive 30 days in this gothic, stone-clad monstrosity to secure a billion-dollar empire I wasn't even sure I wanted. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper who looked like she hadn't smiled since the Reagan administration, met me in the cavernous marble foyer. She eyed my scuffed duffel bag and my worn denim jacket with thinly veiled disdain. "Welcome to the Gallagher residence, Ms. Harding. Shall I have the staff unpack your belongings?" "I can handle my own bag, Mrs. Gable." "Thank you," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The temperature in here had to be 10 degrees colder than outside. "Very well. Dinner is served at precisely 8 o'clock in the formal dining room. Lateness is not tolerated." She turned on her heel and glided away like a ghost. I didn't even make it to my assigned room in the East Wing before my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Louise, my foreman back at the restoration site in the city. "Hey, boss," Louise's voice crackled through the speaker, accompanied by the familiar, comforting sound of power drills in the background. "We have a problem. The lumber supplier just called. They tried to run the corporate card for the oak beams. It bounced. The account is frozen." I stopped in the middle of the long, portrait-lined hallway. I let out a slow, sharp breath. Declan. He hadn't even waited 24 hours. As a board member, he still had enough executive leverage to temporarily freeze auxiliary accounts while the transition of power was in probate limbo. It was a petty, desperate move designed to choke my business and force me to come crawling to him. "All right, Louise. Don't panic," I said, my mind racing. "Run my personal emergency credit card, the blue one. It has enough limit to cover the beams. Get the materials on site by tomorrow morning." "Are you sure, Sloane? That's your safety net." "Just do it, Louise. The roof doesn't wait for family drama." I hung up, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. Declan thought he could starve me out. He thought I was playing a game of chess. He didn't realize I was an architect. If I didn't like the board, I would just take a sledgehammer to the table. By Saturday afternoon, I was exhausted. I had spent the morning at the site, covered in brick dust, sweat, and dried plaster, making sure the load-bearing walls were secured. When I finally dragged myself back to the North Shore estate, all I wanted was a hot shower and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Instead, I walked into an ambush. As I crossed the foyer toward the grand staircase, a wave of high-pitched laughter and the clinking of fine porcelain drifted from the sunlit conservatory. I froze. "Oh, look, everyone!" A voice practically dripped with venom. "The help has finally arrived." I turned. Maeve was standing at the entrance of the conservatory, holding a delicate teacup. Behind her, a dozen women dressed in pastel designer dresses were lounging on velvet sofas. They were the apex predators of Chicago's high society, women who spent their days organizing charity galas and destroying reputations over cucumber sandwiches. I looked down at my steel-toed boots, which were currently tracking gray plaster dust onto the pristine Turkish rug. I looked back at Maeve. She was smirking, waiting for me to shrink away in shame. I didn't. I dropped my heavy duffel bag onto the floor with a loud thump and walked straight toward the conservatory. "Maeve," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the sudden, uncomfortable silence of her guests. I wasn't aware we were hosting a convention for people who peak in high school. A woman in a ridiculously oversized sun hat gasped. Maeve's smile vanished. "Excuse me? These are my closest friends. We are having a private afternoon tea. Something you clearly know nothing about given your aesthetic." She gestured dismissively at my dirt-stained clothes. "I'm Sloane," I said, stepping into the room, making sure my dusty boots left clear footprints on the polished hardwood. I didn't introduce myself as a Gallagher. I didn't need to, and I'm currently the majority shareholder of the roof over your heads. I walked over to the nearest silver platter, picked up a tiny, crustless salmon sandwich with my dirty fingers, and took a bite. It tasted like expensive air. "You see this conservatory?" I asked the room at large, pointing to the elaborate glass ceiling. "Late Victorian style. Very pretty. But the iron framework is rusting at the joints. One heavy Chicago blizzard, and that glass is going to come crashing down directly onto your designer hats." I tossed the rest of the sandwich back onto the tray. "Enjoy the tea, ladies. And Maeve? Next time you throw a party in my house, make sure you pay the caterers up front. I've frozen your expense accounts. Have a great weekend." I turned and walked away, leaving behind a room so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The adrenaline tasted infinitely better than the salmon. That night, the adrenaline faded, leaving me hollow and wired. I was sitting on the edge of my antique four-poster bed, staring blankly at the wall, when a soft knock broke the silence. The door opened to reveal Cecelia, carrying a silver tray with a steaming porcelain cup. "I thought you might need this," Cecelia said softly, her cashmere sweater looking impossibly soft in the dim lighting. "Chamomile. It helps with the nerves." "Thank you," I murmured, taking the cup. The heat warmed my calloused hands. Cecelia sat gracefully on the velvet armchair across from the bed. She looked at me with those deeply sympathetic eyes. "I heard about what happened with Maeve this afternoon. I apologize, Sloane. She is acting out of fear. They both are. They're acting like spoiled children throwing a tantrum because someone took their toys away," I corrected her, taking a sip of the tea. Cecelia sighed, looking down at her hands. "Arthur was a complicated man. He built an empire, but he destroyed his family in the process. He demanded perfection from Declan and Maeve, but he never gave them love. And your mother—" She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Elena was the collateral damage of his ambition." I stiffened. No one in this family ever spoke my mother's name, not out loud. "He loved her, you know," Cecelia continued, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "Arthur truly loved Elena, but when the media turned on her, when those terrible rumors started about her drinking, the plagiarism accusations, Arthur panicked. He couldn't risk the Gallagher stock plummeting. He abandoned her to protect the company. It was the coward's way out." Cecelia looked up, meeting my gaze. "I tried to convince him to help her. I really did, Sloane. But he was terrified of the scandal. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. Her career was ruined. I think leaving everything to you was his final, desperate attempt at an apology." I stared at the tea in my cup. The narrative fit. It made sense. The ruthless businessman choosing his company over the woman he loved. The guilt eating him alive for 20 years until it finally gave him a heart attack. "Thank you for telling me that, Cecelia," I said quietly. "Get some rest, sweetheart," she smiled, standing up. "Tomorrow is a new day." She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. I placed the teacup on the nightstand. I didn't drink another drop. Cecilia's story was perfect. It was a flawless, tragic romance. But I am an architect. I don't trust flawless things. When a wall looks too perfect, it usually means someone is trying to hide a crack in the foundation. At 2 a.m., the mansion was dead silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. I slipped out of bed, pulled on a dark hoodie, and grabbed my small leather tool roll from my duffel bag. I crept down the grand staircase, avoiding the 3rd and 7th steps which I'd already noticed creaked under pressure. Arthur's private study was on the ground floor, at the end of a long, unlit corridor. Since his death, the door had been locked. Declan had tried to get in twice, but Vance held the only key, citing probate protocols. I didn't need a key. I knelt in front of the heavy oak door. The lock was a classic mortise cylinder, sturdy, but old. It took me exactly 45 seconds to feel the satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, turning on the small pen-like clip to my shirt. The room smelled intensely of Arthur, cigar smoke, leather, and old paper. The walls were lined with heavy bookshelves. The massive mahogany desk in the center was completely clear. Vance had already swept the room for official documents. But Vance was a lawyer, not a structural engineer. I began to pace the perimeter of the room, shining my light on the baseboards, the wood paneling, the built-in shelves. I tapped the wood with the heavy handle of a screwdriver. Thud, 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 solid. I moved to the bookshelves behind the desk. I ran my fingers along the decorative molding at the base. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but my thumb caught on a microscopic gap in the joinery, a gap that shouldn't be there. I tapped the wood directly behind the desk chair. Hollow. My heart rate spiked. I wedged a flathead screwdriver into the tiny gap and applied pressure. The wood groaned, protesting, before giving way with a sharp snap. A 2-foot section of the baseboard popped off, revealing a dark, dusty cavity in the floorboards. Inside was a small, heavy steel lockbox. I dragged it out. It was secured by a cheap, modern combination padlock, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $10. Arthur Gallagher wouldn't use a cheap lock. This wasn't Arthur's secret. I didn't bother trying to guess the code. I wrapped the lock in a thick leather work glove to muffle the sound, grabbed a heavy bronze paperweight from the desk, and brought it down hard on the shackle. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the cheap metal shattered. I opened the box. Inside, there were no gold bars, no secret wills, no cash. Just 3 thick manila folders. I opened the first one. My breath caught in my throat. It was a stack of bank statements from a Cayman Islands offshore account, dating back 20 years. Attached to the statements were carbon copies of wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, moving consistently every month. I flipped to the second folder. It contained contracts and invoices from a company called Apex Media Strategy. I knew that name. Everyone in the public relations world knew that name. They were a dark PR firm, the kind of people you hired when you wanted to completely obliterate someone's life using the media. They didn't fix reputations. They destroyed them. I looked at the dates on the Apex invoices. They perfectly aligned with the exact month the media started publishing the fake stories about my mother's scandals and plagiarism. My hands began to shake. Arthur hadn't abandoned my mother to the wolves. Someone had paid the wolves to tear her apart. I grabbed the bank statements again, shining my penlight frantically on the sender's details. Who authorized the wire transfers? Who hired the PR firm? The name on the offshore account wasn't Arthur Gallagher. It wasn't Gallagher Enterprises. It was registered to a holding company named C. Thorne Trust. I stared at the name until the letters blurred together in the dim light. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Thorne. It was a name I had seen just yesterday, printed neatly on the cover of a high society charity gala magazine sitting in the foyer. It was the maiden name of the woman who had just brought me chamomile tea. Cecelia. Cecelia hadn't tried to save my mother. Cecelia was the one who had bought the bullets that executed her career. I sat back on the floor, the cold air of the study seeping into my bones. The picture of the grieving, benevolent stepmother shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. I was locked in a house with a ghost, a pair of angry heirs, and a woman who had orchestrated the destruction of my family simply to clear her own path to the altar. She wanted me to feel safe. She wanted me to trust her. I carefully packed the folders into my bag, pushed the lockbox back into the hollow space, and snapped the baseboard back into place. I walked out of the study, the darkness of the hallway no longer intimidating. I wasn't just an architect anymore. I was a demolition expert. And Cecelia Thorne's perfect little world was about to come crashing down. I didn't sleep. By 6 a.m., I was running purely on black coffee and a cold, vibrating sense of clarity. When you spend your life fixing old buildings, you learn that every structure tells a story. The Gallagher family was no different. It was a skyscraper built on a sinkhole, and I had just found the blueprints to the demolition. At exactly 7:30 a.m., The heavy mahogany doors of the formal dining room swung open. Harrison Vance walked in, carrying his ever-present leather briefcase. Right behind him was a man I hadn't met yet, Marcus Ridge, the chief financial officer of Gallagher Enterprises. He looked like a man who woke up every morning and ironed his socks. "Good morning, Miss Harding," Vance said, taking a seat at the long, polished table. "It's Gallagher now," I said smoothly, taking a sip of my coffee. I sat directly at the head of the table, Arthur's old chair. "Let's get straight to it. Mr. Ridge, I assume Vance briefed you on the power transition?" Ridge adjusted his expensive tie, looking deeply uncomfortable taking orders from a woman wearing a faded flannel shirt. "Yes, as the majority shareholder, you have full executive clearance. However, summoning the CFO to a breakfast meeting on a Sunday is highly irregular." "Irregular is my brother freezing my corporate accounts," I interrupted, placing my coffee cup down with a sharp clack. "Irregular is what I found in my father's floorboards at 2 in the morning. Before Ridge could respond, the dining room doors slammed open. Declan stormed in, his hair ruffled, wearing a silk robe. He looked furious. "What the hell is going on here?" Declan demanded, glaring at Vance. "Why is my CFO having breakfast with the handyman?" I didn't even look at him. "Sit down, Declan, or leave. But if you interrupt me again, I'll call the bank and have your little monthly allowance routed to a donkey sanctuary in Texas." Declan's jaw locked. His hands balled into fists, but he didn't say a word. He pulled out a chair and sat heavily, his eyes burning holes into the side of my head. "Now," I said, turning my attention back to Ridge. I reached into my bag and pulled out the copies I had made from the Apex Media strategy folders. I slid them across the polished mahogany. "Mr. Ridge, I want you to look at these wire transfers." Ridge picked up the papers. His eyes scanned the numbers, his brow furrowing. "These are offshore transfers. Cayman Islands. Routed through a shell corporation. They date back 20 years. $300,000, I stated, the number still making my stomach twist. Paid in installments to a dark PR firm called Apex Media. They specialize in corporate sabotage and character assassination. The dates on those payments perfectly align with the media smear campaign that destroyed my mother's career." Declan let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Are you kidding me? You called an emergency financial meeting to play detective over some ancient tabloid gossip about your crazy mother?" "Declan, I highly suggest you remain silent," Vance warned, his tone suddenly sharp. He had recognized the name of the PR firm. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the CFO. "Mr. Ridge, I need to know exactly who authorized those transfers. The account is linked to a holding company called the Seathorn Trust. I want to know who controls it." Ridge looked at Vance, a silent question passing between them. "Mr. Ridge," I said, dropping my voice to a dangerous whisper, "I own 73% of the company that pays your bonus. You work for me. Who is Seathorn?" Ridge cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Gallagher, the Seathorn Trust is completely separate from Gallagher Enterprises. It is a private entity." "Who owns it?" I pressed, not giving him an inch. Vance sighed, a long, tired sound. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Client confidentiality does not apply here, Marcus, as the trust was technically funded by Arthur's personal dividends, which Ms. Gallagher now controls." "Tell her." Ridge swallowed hard. "The trust belongs to Cecelia Gallagher. Her maiden name was Thorne." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Declan froze, his arrogant smirk melting off his face. "Wait, what did you just say?" he muttered, looking between Ridge and Vance. "Cecelia? Cecelia doesn't get her hands dirty. She just hosts charity galas and gardens." "She's a gardener, all right," I said, my voice eerily calm. "She just prefers burying people." I stood up, walking slowly around the massive table. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping together, forming a picture so ugly it made my skin crawl. 20 years ago, I began, pacing behind Declan's chair. My mother was the only woman Arthur ever actually wanted to marry after his divorce. But she was a liability. She was an artist. She wasn't high society. So Cecelia, the perfect, elegant, high society darling, hired a firm to plant fake stories about my mother. Arthur was terrified of bad PR. Vance added quietly, staring at the table. When the stock started to dip because of the rumors, he cut your mother off completely. And Cecelia swooped in to comfort the grieving billionaire. I finished, stopping near the windows overlooking the snow-covered lawn. She got the ring. She got the name. This is insane, Declan whispered, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he didn't look angry, he looked genuinely rattled. Why would my father leave the company to you if he knew she did this? Because he didn't know, I said, turning to face them. He probably only found out right before he died. That's why he hid the files and the floorboards. He was building a case against her, but his heart gave out first. I looked at the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. Cecilia's chair. Cecelia couldn't touch the company because of her ironclad prenuptial agreement. I reasoned aloud, the cold logic taking over. Declan and Maeve hate her, so she couldn't control them. But an illegitimate daughter? A girl who grew up with nothing, suddenly thrust into a billionaire's world? She thought I would be easy prey. She played the protective, loving stepmother, so I would hand the reins over to her the second things got tough. She set you up as a puppet, Ridge said, realization dawning on his face. Exactly, I said. So what do we do? Declan asked. The we didn't escape my notice. The enemy of my enemy was currently sitting in a silk robe, realizing his beloved stepmother was a sociopath. Mr. Ridge, I said, walking back to my chair, I want you to freeze every single charitable account, trust fund, and discretionary line of credit attached to Cecelia Gallagher's name. Cut her off completely. Ms. Gallagher, doing that without a board vote could. I am the board, Marcus. I snapped, the authority finally feeling natural in my chest. Do it. And Vance, I turned to the lawyer, call the FBI. Tell the white-collar crime division, we have a massive case of financial fraud and wire manipulation involving a dark PR firm. Tell them to send agents to the estate. Vance nodded slowly, snapping his briefcase shut. It will be done within the hour. As the two men hurried out of the dining room, leaving only Declan and me in the heavy silence, I looked down at my hands. They were steady. No trembling. No fear. I had spent my whole life cleaning up the wreckage left behind by this family. But tonight, I wasn't going to restore anything. Tonight, I was going to watch Cecelia Thorne's empire burn to the ground. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth of the main living room, casting long, dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. It was 8 p.m. The house was dead quiet. Cecelia was sitting on the cream-colored sofa, wearing a silk emerald blouse, a first-edition novel resting on her lap, and a glass of expensive Pinot Noir by her side. She looked like a portrait of domestic perfection. I walked in. My boots were heavy on the Persian rug. The manila folder felt even heavier in my hand. Reading anything good? I asked, stopping on the opposite side of the glass coffee table. Cecelia looked up, offering that same saintly maternal smile. Just some old classics, dear. Did you get any rest? You've been looking so pale since the reading. I didn't smile back. I simply tossed the folder onto the table. It landed with a sharp smack that made the wine in her glass tremble. I did some reading of my own, I said, my voice eerily calm. Mostly bank statements from the Cayman Islands. A few invoices from a company called Apex Media Strategy. Turns out, old floorboards hold on to a lot of history. Cecelia looked down at the folder. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop her glass. She didn't even blink. She just slowly closed her book and set it aside. When she looked back up at me, the warmth in her eyes was completely gone. The maternal glow vanished, replaced by something flat, cold, and utterly reptilian. He always was sloppy with his paperwork, Cecelia murmured. She took a slow sip of her wine. I told him to burn those years ago. Her calmness was terrifying. It wasn't a confession. It was an acknowledgement of a minor inconvenience. You destroyed her, I said, the anger finally vibrating in my chest. My mother was a brilliant artist. You hired a dark PR firm to fabricate drug rumors and plagiarism scandals just to clear her out of your way. I secured an asset, Cecelia corrected smoothly, as if we were discussing a stock portfolio. Arthur was a billionaire acting like a love-struck teenager. He was going to give her half the company, Sloane. He was going to legitimize a chaotic, emotional violinist and put the Gallagher legacy at risk. I simply protected the ecosystem. I did what was necessary. You ruined a woman's life for a ring. I did it for the empire, she shot back, her voice dropping an octave, devoid of any gentle inflection. And it worked perfectly, until Arthur's guilty conscience started acting up in his final months. I shook my head, staring at the monster sitting on the couch. If you hated her so much, why me? Why did you spend the last 10 years whispering in Arthur's ear, making him feel so guilty that he left the entire company to the daughter of the woman you destroyed? Cecelia laughed. It wasn't musical anymore. It was dry, hollow, and cruel. Because Declan and Maeve are arrogant idiots, Cecelia said, leaning forward. They wouldn't listen to me. I couldn't control them. But you? The poor, abandoned, illegitimate child playing in the dirt? I thought if I brought you into the castle, if I played the only person in this family who actually cared about you, you'd hand me the executive keys out of sheer gratitude. You were supposed to be my puppet, Sloane. A grateful little girl willing to let her savior run the show behind the curtain. I'm an architect, Cecelia, I said, stepping closer to the table. I build structures. I don't let people pull my strings. Cecelia stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse. She looked completely unbothered. It doesn't matter. You found some old papers. You can't definitively prove I authorized those transfers 20 years ago. And without me to guide you, the board of directors will eat you alive by next quarter. You need me, Sloane. Play nice, let me handle the corporate strategy, and you can go back to playing with your little hammers and chisels while collecting a massive paycheck. She reached out, as if to touch my shoulder. I stepped back. You're right about one thing, I said, checking my watch. I can't prove everything right now. But the FBI's white-collar crime division has much better forensic accountants than I do. Cecilia's hand froze mid-air. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch. What did you just say? I had a breakfast meeting with Marcus Ridge and Harrison Vance at 7:30 this morning. I explained, my voice as cold as the Chicago wind outside. I used my executive authority to freeze the Seathorn Trust. I froze your charitable foundations. I cut off every single line of credit attached to your name. You don't have a dime of corporate money to fight with. And Vance handed those unredacted documents over to the feds 12 hours ago. Through the thick, soundproofed windows, the faint, wailing sound of sirens began to echo up the long, winding driveway of the North Shore estate. Red and blue lights started flashing through the falling snow, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers in the room. Panic, raw, unfiltered panic, finally broke through Cecilia's flawless mask. Her hands started to visibly shake. You little fool, Cecelia hissed, stepping toward me, her voice shrill. You have no idea what you've just done. I built this family. I held this company together while Arthur was dying. No, I said softly, turning my back on her and walking toward the massive double doors of the foyer. You just decorated it. And honestly, your taste is terrible. Sloane, she screamed, the sound echoing off the marble floors as the heavy oak front doors burst open. Men in dark windbreakers bearing the FBI insignia flooded the entryway. I didn't stop, I didn't look back. I walked right past the agents, stepping out into the freezing night air. I pulled the collar of my denim jacket tight against the wind, the cold feeling incredibly refreshing after the suffocating heat of that house. I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit speed dial. It rang twice. Luis? I said as my foreman picked up, the loud, chaotic noise of the city construction site booming through the speaker. Hey boss, everything okay? The oak beams just got delivered. We're ready when you are. I looked back at the Gallagher mansion. Through the grand window, I could see Cecelia being read her rights, her perfect posture finally crumbling as handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The sinkhole had collapsed. Everything is perfect, Luis. I smiled, walking down the driveway toward my battered pickup truck. I'll be on site in 45 minutes. Get the sledgehammers ready. It's time to tear down some walls.